In high school, I was a bit like Hermione Granger in the worst way. I was just an awkward kid who understood the material as well as the teacher did. I was that odd kid who read history books during the summer for fun. I'd constantly be raising my hand in class with the answer, looking for validation. That kind of behavior got me picked on quite a bit by a certain group of students in my history class. They'd tease me, mostly behind my back, but they weren't above cheating off me on the tests as they were difficult, and they knew that I knew the answers. Very few of my test scores in this subject were below 100%, as history is a passion of mine. Initially, I was flattered, but over the semester, I got the sinking feeling of being used, as these same kids didn't show me respect in any other way. Our final history exam was a 50 questions multiple choice test that would be worth 30% of our grade. The stakes couldn't be higher. The teacher wrote the questions to be tricky. On the day of the final, I scanned through the test in a few minutes. I knew the material and felt confident. My peers on either side of my desk were watching to see how I'd answer. Their neighbors were, in turn, discreetly watching them. It seemed as if the entire side of my class was hanging on my answers. I answered the first 3 questions accurately. Then I went for the almost correct answer every other time. This resulted in a 54% score. I was careful to let the other kids see my test. Then, when I finished, I waited and stared at the wall with my test still in front of me. The time was running out, and my classmates all began nervously turning in their tests, until only a couple of students on the other side of the room remained. With 5 minutes left, I stood up abruptly, crinkled my test into a ball, and threw it into the garbage. I was trying to be dramatic. It worked! You've never heard such a stunned silence. I quickly grabbed a new test from the table. There were a couple still there, missing students. With a shocked smile, the teacher said, "There's only 5 minutes left." I didn't care. I had spent the period memorizing the correct answers. With no time to spare, I answered the questions in a complete whirlwind. A BCA BDDD A BCCA BB. My friends told me later that everyone was staring. I didn't have the bandwidth to see it. With 10 seconds left, I turned in my test. The kids that had cheated off me looked pale and sickly, in a state of shock. They knew that I screwed them over. They just didn't know how badly. There was nothing they could say or do. I was one of 3 students that had an A in that class that semester. The average grade was in the low A60s. That low grade for my classmates ended up knocking several kids out of the running for valedictorian several years later. Oddly, I was treated with noticeably more respect after this, and I wasn't cheated off of again, as far as I could tell. Apprehensive Skill 34 commented, "I was like this in my history classes. I loved it and had a fantastic memory for these things. I always sat in the front of the class and listened. I skipped class one day because I hated my history teacher, and there was a test that day. He gave me a 0, and he said you have to get an 80 on the final if you want to pass my class. I got a 100, not a single question wrong. I shoved it in his face the next year and said, 'Glad to not be in your class anymore.' In next year's class, I had a girl who was just terrible at school, but very nice to me. It was her last day and a test in that class. I allowed her to copy off of me, and we got the same score. The teacher asked me if she cheated, and I just kept my mouth shut because she never bullied me and treated me badly. I said maybe she just put the effort through for her last day. 'You're welcome, Sabrina. I hope you're not still on the streets.' I think this responded, 'As a teenager, I could be my best self who was kind, helpful, listened well, and always worked hard. Or I could be my asshole teenage self who was a sarcastic little twerp. I took AP American History and had a friend from Debate Forensics in class with me. We would basically talk about whatever we wanted. The teacher wasn't a bad guy, and we were probably disruptive, but whenever he tried to embarrass me by asking me questions, I would answer in more detail, he offered. He once told me that if I liked to talk so much, I could teach that part of the class. So I got to teach about the Southern theater of the Revolutionary War through Yorktown. I think and I spent more time on the historical significance of cow pens and calling it the American can. But hey, he asked. Shadows Og95 responded, when I was in school every Friday, there was a basketball, volleyball, or football game after school. The middle school would open the concession stand right after school, an hour or two before the game started, even on away games, so students could get snacks. And the coach was also the history teacher, so I would let kids cheat off of me, given the condition that I got $1, what the stand charged for literally everything. My mom wasn't big on junk food, but every weekend I would have a stash of soda and candy to bring to my neighborhood friends when we snuck out to the woods at night. This did eventually evolve into how I got weed and alcohol in high school, but it all started with me being a history nerd and having friends willing to give me money for good grades and other friends making sure I wasn't being taken advantage of because I had the goods. I think he broke this also commented, I think the two of us might have been friends if we were in school together. I never had any issues with history classes. In college, I would noose them to get easy As. In my 7th grade history class, there was a kid who tried to bully me. Anyway, we were covering WW2, and honestly, the class was stupidly easy anyway. Regardless, we had a quiz, and he kept asking if who was the leader of Great Britain during WW2. He kept asking if it was Hitler, because he was an idiot. I turned to him and sacked, "Yep, it's Adolf Hitler, because Adolf is a really English-sounding name." The quiz was graded in class, and the dude couldn't understand why I was laughing my ass off. He was like, "You got all these questions wrong." I told him I didn't miss any questions. He also got a lesson in sarcasm that day. BigNet9971 commented, when I was a kid in chemistry class, a bunch of kids were cheating on multiple choice tests when the teacher left the room. Kids copying answers from each other. Sometimes kids even asking, what's the answer to error 23? I didn't care. I studied and answered the questions myself, except that we were graded on a curve. So their cheating lowered my grade. Not cool. I wrestled with the ethics of the situation and finally told the teacher that a bunch of kids were cheating, but I would not tell him which ones. I simply urged him not to leave the room during tests. He said he would handle it. At the next test, the teacher handed out the tests and then left the room perhaps 5 minutes later. I was annoyed, but I just plowed through the test and handed it in at the end of the session. The teacher did pop in and out all through the test. It was only once the tests were graded and handed back that I learned what he'd done. He made 4 or 5 different versions of the test, all with the same questions, but all in different sequences. So one person's question 23 was different from the next person's question 23, as was the multiple choice answer. Like the OP's story, there were a lot of crestfallen students that day. Also, it was easy for the teacher to ID who'd been cheating because they went from averages in the 90s to a score 40s on this test, and he stayed in the room during tests for the rest of the year.